the seventh session of our time in United Methodist Polity. Today we are going to review in a bit of detail two interlocking pieces and very, very important pieces. And those would be the superintendency, meaning bishops and superintendents, as well as the conferences. Specifically, the conferences that are not the local charge conference, but the general conference, the jurisdictional conference, the annual conference, and simply a word about a district conference. And so these would be found in the discipline in paragraphs 4, 5, and 600. Although in the second slide of the PowerPoint, it refers to the 600s. That's basically the annual conference. And I want to start there. I don't want to start with the episcopacy. I want to start with the conference. Because although we talk about the local church, the charge conference, that local setting as being key for disciple making and for the intersection between the church and the world, and it has a place of privilege in the discipline, it was not always so. The annual conference used to be, and formatively was, the place where the connection actually occurred, the annual conference. Now today, the annual conference has become the general conference. And it is because the global ministry and mission of the church has actually expanded. So it became impossible early on, even when it expanded across the United States, for the circuit riders, the itinerants, to meet once a year. It was simply an impossible task. So they met every 4 years and developed a cycle of meeting in the general conference, which is called a quadrennia, which is a peculiarly Methodist word. Every 4 years, the general conference meets, and we'll talk about that in a minute. But the annual conference, this yearly meeting of the itinerant preachers, to ask each other, and specifically to ask the leader, who was Wesley or Asbury, and eventually became Bishop Asbury or Rankin or several of the other leaders, these two purposes. One, how are we to do the mission? And the early disciplines, if you will, were not so much a book of law as they were a catechesis, a question and answer. So number one, it was, how do we do our mission? What is our mission and how do we do it? Number two, it had to do with appointments. What circuits are the itinerants, or later to become elders, appointed? And these two critical issues, what is our mission and how do we do it, as a connection, and where are the elders appointed, were the two critical questions. Now clearly, the expansion of appointment has been from elders or itinerants to elders, deacons, and then there is the assignment of licensed local pastors. But the critical issue of appointment is still there. And what supports those appointments is that at the annual conference, the elders and the deacons become members there. They are members of the annual conference. And that's an absolutely critical thing for us to understand. That deacons and elders are no longer members of the local church, although they have to go through the process of being approved by staff parish and then by the charge conference. They are no longer under the care and examination of the district to whom they go next. They have been approved to go before the conference board of the ordained ministry. And then they are accepted into membership, both provisional as well as full, in the annual conference amongst the ordained, and commended to the bishop for ordination. And so deacons and elders hold their membership in the annual conference. Now, as we're on that issue, let me talk about the other actors that come together at annual conference and where their membership lies. The annual conference is where deacons and elders hold their membership. Lay members to annual conference, so they are members there, also hold their membership in the local church. Deacons and elders do not. That's where they're appointed to serve, but they are not members there. Lay people are members of the local church, and they are members of the annual conference. Some of them forget that, and they think they're delegates to the annual conference. They're not. They're members. And so laity and clergy together form their membership. Licensed local pastors hold their licensure and their assignment in the district, and that's a critical issue. And bishops hold their membership no longer in the annual conference, but their membership comes to the Council of Bishops. And so although all of these persons meet together and have a role at the annual conference, you see their memberships are in different places and their identity for different reasons. And so the second slide here again points us to the annual conference. And the annual conference was the original place of meeting for the circuit riders, as I said. It had the two purposes that I talked about. And they basically were responsive to the issues of the former year missionally, but also, and this becomes a very big piece and a piece of debate at the annual conference, a huge part of the annual conference was how do we care for the clergy? And so you will find at annual conference the care of the clergy. What are the minimum salaries that are to be awarded? That gets voted every year. What are the other benefits or provisions made for the clergy? What are the standards for the parsonages in which they live that are across the annual conference? What is the pension? What is the health insurance? And what are the other rules and regulations by which the clergy will live together in covenant? Of course, these meetings began as the circuit riders and then the elders and then the clergy together, and the laity wanted to know what was going on, and they became observers in the early days, and now they are fully members. And so when you come to annual conference, and still we call it that, and the annual conference is that which meets annually, you will have an executive session, and that's where the clergy gather, mainly to deal with the issues of the clergy. It's a report given by the board of the ordained ministry to the clergy session. And the clergy vote on clergy matters. And then you have the general plenary in which both clergy and laity meet. And that is where the larger mission, ministry, budget, and administrative order is discussed. Now, the purpose that I want to talk about, and this goes back, it's interesting that the purpose is uniform with the mission of the church, which is to make disciples of Jesus Christ. And you will see this in slide 3. And the focus of the annual conference, according to the discipline, is to equip the local churches for ministry. In other words, referring back to that place of privilege that the local church has here, as well as to provide a place of connection beyond the local church. Now let me just take a moment to reflect on that at the annual conference. Clearly, it is still a place for the clergy to vote on clergy matters. Who becomes a member? Do they become a provisional member? Are they moved on to become a full member? How are we in covenant with one another? That's clearly often in tension with the fact that the clergy are appointed, and sometimes for long stretches of time, to a particular church. And so the loyalties get stretched. The whole notion of yearning to get to annual conference to see your colleagues and to sing "And Are We Yet Alive," which was a statement of hope and a statement of commitment to see each other's face. This whole notion that this is the group to whom I belong, that we share a ministry and a mission and a faith and a passion. I find that oftentimes those sentiments, those spirits, have begun to drift aside, and this becomes a place of credentialing, that we get our provisional credentials and then finally our full credentials, and we are fully vested and enfranchised. I will leave that to your reflection about what this means about being church together. Is this a binding together truly of a spirit in a common ministry and mission that is shared? And my sense of it is that those who are members of the clergy care about the whole connection. That's clearly who we are. And the other piece that I would say is that many times folks look at the annual conference not as a place to resource the local church, which is a stated goal, but oftentimes that it becomes a para-church. And many times this happens because of the infrastructure of the conference itself that has connectional ministries and missions, and also participates in the larger ministry and mission of the general conference. So there are people who are not as involved in their local church, but are involved in annual conference ministries and missions. And I'm talking not only about clergy at this point, but clearly also about the laity. I would also say that part of what leads to this is that the annual conference doesn't meet just annually. The annual conference is actually a set of offices and groups of committees and commissions that meet throughout the year. And so annual conference as a name hangs on from the old days, if you will, where it did only meet annually. And then the circuit riders were sent to their various charges and supervised by an itinerant bishop who would follow them on horseback, to now the annual conference is often referred to as the office building in Chicago. Where I'm from, which is the New England Conference, it's the office building in Lawrence, Massachusetts. I visit the bishop in eastern Pennsylvania and go to King of Prussia throughout the year. And, western Pennsylvania, I've been to see the bishop there in Cranberry Township, and I go on and on and on to the various places. So that the annual conference is actually the offices where the bishop and the various constituent parts of the conference meet. And so I just want you to be able to grapple with what the annual conference does. Also, and you'll see this outlined in slide number 4, is this whole notion that we go from this yearly meeting in order to look into the past and see the future, to basically join the clergy together and send them out to the local church. And although the focus at that point was the annual conference, that made the connection, there was far more real attention paid to the local, because there was no annual conference to go through the year. There were not a lot of superstructures to get involved in. There wasn't a conference office to go to. So it was the local area that was very important to them. But because of the large amount of administration that needs to happen to keep this all going, they've now become geographical administration. And so every annual conference has a border that is set by the jurisdictional conference, and we'll talk about that in a minute. And so we are sitting physically here at Garrett Evangelical Theological Seminary in the Northern Illinois Annual Conference. That conference is part of the Chicago area. The area is where the bishop is assigned, and in this case, Bishop Sally Dick, who is the bishop here, is assigned by the Jurisdictional Episcopal Committee to the Chicago area, which is the Northern Illinois Annual Conference. it isn't always true that an area is equal to a conference. Bishop Hagia, who is in the northwestern section of the United States, in the western jurisdiction, has 3 annual conferences that encompass Oregon, Idaho, Washington, and Alaska. Geographically, a huge part of the United States, and has just in the last quadrennium eclipsed Northern Europe and Eurasia as the largest episcopal area in the connection. 1 area, 3 annual conferences. And so you see there was a shift from this annual meeting to a geographic administration. The areas are episcopal, the conferences are these kind of boundary jurisdictions that can only be set or changed not by themselves, the annual conference, but by the jurisdictional conference. And again, we'll get to that in a minute. Annual conferences are now getting larger and larger and larger geographically in order to have reputedly an economy of scale. But as one who in the New England Annual Conference, what is today the New England Annual Conference, I joined that annual conference when it was called the Southern New England Conference, which basically was most of Massachusetts, Rhode Island, and half of Connecticut. And they were still recovering from the fact that the Southern New England Conference was a merger of the old New England Southern and New England conferences to form the geographic area that I talked about, Massachusetts, Rhode Island, and part of Connecticut. While I was in that annual conference, it expanded and included in it all of Maine, all of New Hampshire, now all of Massachusetts, all of Rhode Island, and half of Connecticut. And today, the New England Annual Conference includes all of Maine, all of New Hampshire, all of Vermont, all of Massachusetts, all of Rhode Island, and still half of Connecticut. You may ask why. It's because the other half of Connecticut, west of the Connecticut River, has always been culturally tied to New York City. You think about the intimacy of mission and of knowability of members of conference from the old New England Southern Conference to now a huge geographic area. We've changed the very nature of conference itself. This is a picture of the global jurisdictions and conferences that we have throughout the world. You will see that in the Western Hemisphere, these are the conferences and jurisdictions of the United Methodist Church. In Europe, the Philippines, and Africa, you have the central conferences of the United Methodist Church. And we'll talk about those a bit in a minute. And so the annual conferences, your annual conference, is part of a jurisdiction. And you see this in slide 6. You will see the jurisdictions of the United States, and these are jurisdictions. Those outside the United States are called central conferences. The jurisdictions are 5: the Northeast, the Southeast, the North Central, the South Central, and the Western jurisdictions. They grew from the East Coast to the West Coast. North and South were designated after the Civil War. Culturally, they have grown in 5 separate ways, and within them, their annual conferences have grown culturally in 5 separate ways. And so it's very important to know where you are. And as the discussion groups in this class show, that many times the culture out of which you come has been shaped by your local church, within a particular annual conference geographic area, within a particular jurisdiction. And so when we talk about the United Methodist Church, many times our understanding of the United Methodist Church is from the local to the more global. And that's why it's sometimes very difficult for us to get our head and hands and heart around the global reality of the church as much as we may want to embrace it as who we are. And so you will see, if you can, the map of the conferences within the jurisdictions as they lay out. Now, let's talk about the annual conference for a minute and who's a member. First of all, it is a legislative body. It makes the rules for the annual conference and the area that it serves. It has two separate meetings. One is the executive session, and you will see who is part of that body, but generally speaking, it is the clergy, which has now included licensed local pastors and some lay persons who could be in that body. It's the executive session, and they have a restricted number of things that they can vote on. And then there is the general plenary where lay and clergy members together come. They can make their own rules for their annual conference as long as they do not violate the rules that are set by the general conference. Clergy are members of the annual conference at two stages. First, and you will see this on this 8th slide, they are voted into provisional membership, which is temporary and used to be called on trial, which is probably much more accurate, much more juridical in that way, but it was called on trial. I was a probationary member when I came in at this level. Again, a juridical term. This is provisional member, which means not temporary, but also means in a state of being provisioned. And so as clergy, you are brought in by vote of the executive session as a provisional member. And then after you fulfill the requirements, you become a full member. You will also see outlined in the discipline that there are associate and affiliate clergy. And although I am a member in the New England Conference, I fall into one of these categories here in the Northern Illinois Conference. And then you have full and part-time local pastors. And so I would say that it's very important to realize who is there and what is their category. How did they come in? Because remember, this is not as egalitarian as it is representative. You are there because you represent something. You are there because you fulfill a practical role in the life of the church. And so that's very, very important. The other thing I would say to you very clearly is this is not an optional meeting. You must be there. You are called to the annual conference by the bishop. It is the bishop's authority to do that. Now, in some annual conferences, what attendance betokens is a little looser than in others. In my annual conference, there is no such thing as taking attendance. In the Northern Illinois Annual Conference, you are assigned to a table. In the Iowa Annual Conference, you are assigned to a table. There is attendance being taken because the necessity is to be present at the annual conference for legislation, for the passage of budget, for policy, for the ordination of elders and deacons, for memorializing those who have passed in the past year. It is United Methodism in its fullest connectional expression, fully representative of the local as well as connected to the global. And it is taken very seriously that you are there in many annual conferences. The 10th slide talks about the very meeting itself. It meets annually and is an open meeting, except for the executive session, meaning not only members are encouraged to come, but so is the rest of the United Methodist Church and the world. In addition to the annual meeting, which in the United States generally happens in the spring because appointments are made that begin on the 1st of July, and this will become a season for you. It's the conference season, the appointment season. But in addition to that yearly meeting, there are oftentimes, or sometimes, depending on where you are, special sessions that are called by the bishop. And just as a special session of the charge conference is called for a specific reason, the special session of the annual conference is called for a very specific reason. Usually, it is something that is essential to annual conference business, dealing with pensions or mortgages or purchases and sales, or that the budget deficit has risen to a place that the Conference Council on Finance and Administration cannot deal with it. Or, on the other side, which is more rare, a windfall has come and they want to know what to do about it. An annual conference is an annual conference when it's presided over by a bishop. And the bishop is the executive officer, presidential officer, but without vote. They preside over the annual conference, and they make decisions of law in that annual conference. And those decisions of law, meaning they interpret the discipline and how it is to be carried out, those are very important for us to understand later on in the course when we come to judicial process, because the bishop's decisions of law, whether this meets with what the discipline says, can be challenged at the judicial council. And so the bishop presides over the annual conference, except in extreme cases when a traveling elder is appointed, but they cannot carry on the critical episcopal work of ordination. There is generally a quadrennial, meaning, remember, every 4 years, when the bishop is appointed to the conference, and usually they're appointed to the area, and preside over the conference for 4 years, or a quadrennium. They can be appointed for an additional 4 years, or quadrennium, and in extraordinary and missional cases for a third 4 years. For each of those quadrennia, there is a conference statistician and a conference secretary elected, one who keeps the minutes and one who keeps the statistics. Very important and historic because they are provided in the general minutes of the church. And so if you go to a United Methodist Seminary library, you will find general minutes for every 4 years of the whole church, and you can find out what happened. The bishop also has the responsibility and the authority to appoint a chancellor, a lawyer, if you will, for the annual conference so that they can advise the bishop and they become the annual conference's chancellor. You can often call that chancellor if you are a pastor of a local church or a leader in a local church to ask advice. They may or may not be able to give that to you, depending on the parameters and boundaries that are set up by the bishop. And they certainly do not become the local church's attorney just because they are the annual conference chancellor, but they can help in some of those legal issues and legal advice. So avail yourself of that as a pastor to know that there is a legal arm of the annual conference. And then there is also a conference lay leader who, like the lay leader in the local church, oftentimes makes their own, sensitive to the context, their own job. You will find that annual conferences, and this is slide 11, annual conferences at the back of most annual conference journals or pre-conference journals set their own rules of governance. And it's very important for you to acquaint yourself with the rules by which legislation is going to be decided. And that is up to each annual conference, except for those that are particularly in the discipline for the whole church. The annual conference sets a budget, but no annual conference can encumber any other annual conference by its decision around a budget. And so therefore, the idea of adopting a 5-year budget is almost impossible, because this year's annual conference cannot encumber the next year by any obligations that it takes. Bear that in mind. It's very important in terms of our understanding of a budget. Clergy membership in the United Methodist Church is held in the annual conference and determined by the annual conference. The way in which the connection operates within itself, the voting of minimal compensation for the clergy, the matters of ordination and memorial all happen at the annual conference. And those are its essential parts and pieces. Also, the very difficult task of the discontinuation of churches happens at the annual conference under a variety of conditions. They are discontinued because they're abandoned. They're discontinued because they leave the denomination. They are discontinued simply because they are no longer viable according to the conditions that are set by the bishop in consultation with the annual conference. The high moment, from my perspective, of annual conference is the ordination service. And you'll see this in slide 12, the ordination of deacons, elders, done by a bishop. It is done by assembling the entire annual conference, and it is here at conference that ordinations are done. This is very different than the free and reformed churches, in which ordinations are done in the local church. So most people in local churches have been present at the ordination of pastors. I would encourage you, if you are not already ordained, and if you don't want to go to an entire annual conference, at least to go to an ordination before it happens to you, and that you bring the laity with you in your churches. These are high moments of ceremony, but they're also deeply embedded in who we are as a connectional church and United Methodists. It is a time when the responsibility for the whole connection, not just for the administration and pastoring or deaconing of a local church, the whole connection is assumed by the individuals who are voted and affirmed and ordained to that task. And so I really would encourage you to do that at some point. Part of the other thing a conference does is it needs to be responsible, as does the local charge conference, for the vision of the ministry and mission through connectional ministries. It is a connecting agency, so it brokers and connects general conference resources, general agency resources, the resources of the annual conference. It gives and receives resources from the districts and from the charge conference. So this is what I would say the connectional or the brokering of a variety of assets for this vital ministry and mission of the church. So vision, asset alignment, nurture, outreach, and witness. Doesn't that sound familiar as to what's critical to the local church and the charge conference to think about is critical to the annual conference? Nurture, outreach, and witness to the end of the transformation of the world, and to align all of those assets and resources for the ministry and mission of the United Methodist Church. It is also important to understand our historic commitments as we in the annual conference are called upon to promote ethnic ministries and to advocate and monitor the inclusivity and the justice of the ministry and mission of the church. There are a variety of agencies that are outlined on slide 14 that are supposed to align with the General Conference and provide for the ministry of the annual conference and the local church. GCF&A is the General Council on Finance and Administration. The local annual conference has a CCF&A, which deals with apportionments. Apportionments, the budget that is voted by the general church at General Conference, is adopted by the annual conference, added to for annual conference ministry and mission, and then apportioned to the local church. CCF&A. They also provide ministerial support for pastors and others who are appointed to local situations who cannot fully support them to the minimum salary that is required. There's also a group that you will become very familiar with, I am sure, the BOOM, an unfortunate acronym, or the Board of the Ordained Ministry, that deals with the admission of persons into ministry, their connection to the ministry throughout their life, as well as their retirement. You will see then, again in the 15th slide, the other areas of administration and programming that are done by the annual conference. And let us simply linger there for a moment to say that they should not be of any surprise as you look through them. They are simply organizations that carry forth the care, like the Episcopal Residency Committee and the trustees, the care of the bishop, the trustees to care for the property, the monitoring agencies that are at the general level, like COSRO and Religion and Race, are also at the annual conference, as well as programmatic agencies like the Conference Council on Youth Ministry and other pieces like that, the Women's Division and the like. So that's the annual conference. There's also, and you'll see this in the 16th slide, the district conference. And this used to be much more robust, but the annual conference, as it grew, that is where the locus and focus was. And the district conferences, because the districts became so big, have been cut down into smaller groups that are not official within the discipline, which are subclusters of the district. But you will confront the district most importantly in the district superintendent, who is basically, some call them mini bishops or the representative of the bishop, but they are the administrators of the district area in that case. And you will probably confront them most in the district committee on the ministry. The first step out of the local church to licensure, as well as candidacy, and to receive a local pastor's license, or to be in care for a bit, and then you're forwarded on to the board of the ordained ministry. And because of the intimate need to fill local churches, not only is the district committee a first step toward ordination at the annual conference level or toward local pastor licensure, the district also holds lay speaking courses in order to provide leadership for the local church through lay speaking and witnesses. Lay service ministries, District United Methodist Women, District United Methodist Men, District United Methodist Youth. And basically these are to gather a smaller group of people on the ground to be able to do greater work. And so we have talked now about the annual conference. We've talked about the district conference. And now I want to talk for a moment about the superintendency. The superintendency you will find in the 400 paragraphs. It is the way in which we talk about bishops and district superintendents. The superintendency began as an idea called the general superintendence of the church. That was Mr. Wesley's understanding of what that office should be. It was only in the Conference of 1784 that the general superintendence of the church, which is an administrative office, became the bishop of the church. So it took on an understanding not only of administration, but that monarchical understanding of bishop that we talked about earlier in the course, who rules over their area, that has in their person, they carry the fullness of the connection with them and represent the full connection to itself. And some have argued, and I believe this is true, that bishops today are the remnant of the fullness of itineration that was envisioned at the beginning of the church. They are throughout the connection, throughout the world. You'll see in the 17th slide that bishops together with superintendents in an area form a cabinet, which is primarily focused on appointments and the health of the local church through their appointments. The appointments of ministerial, clerical, pastoral leadership to that church, as well as the fixing of the appointments of deacons, not only in the local church, but also in their ministries of justice and compassion in the world. In addition to appointments, there's become a programmatic cabinet, which takes care of those other areas of conference life that I talked about, and these are two separate pieces that oftentimes meet together. Now, the bishop is assigned to an area, which is one or more annual conferences, by the jurisdictional conference. A jurisdictional conference is made up of, geographically, a number of areas and annual conferences that has two purposes. One is to elect bishops to be able to serve the areas of the jurisdiction. And two is to set the boundaries of the annual conference and to determine which conferences go together to form an area. The annual conference meets annually, the appointment of clergy there. The jurisdictional conference meets every 4 years, as does the general conference. Now let me show you in the next slide. This is the North Central jurisdiction in which Garrett Evangelical Theological Seminary sits. And I'll tell you a bit about the way in which these assignments are made and the elections are done at jurisdictional conference. You will see to the far left side of this slide, Bishop Bruce O. Bishop O is elected and has served in the West Ohio Conference. At the last jurisdictional conference, it was decided, based upon legislation at the General Conference, that we needed to basically consolidate areas. And so, if you will see here, Bishop O is assigned to an area that includes the Minnesota Annual Conference and the Dakotas Annual Conference, and that is in one area. Prior to 2012, that was two separate areas, the Dakotas and Minnesota. It is now one area, two annual conferences. Bishop Jung is in Wisconsin, Bishop Trimble in Iowa. Those two are areas that are the same as their annual conferences. Then you have Bishop Sally Dick, as I said before, who is in the Northern Illinois Annual Conference, but the Chicago area. It says an awful lot about the culture, doesn't it? And the people from Galena, which is on the Mississippi River in the western part of this annual conference, may not fully appreciate that. But this is the College of Bishops, which is the bishops gathered from a jurisdiction, is called a college. The entire group of bishops that gather throughout the world is called the council. And so as you're making your way through these words, the colleges are from the jurisdictions. The council is the entirety of the church. You see here in slide 19, this is the Southeast jurisdiction. It is one of the most populous jurisdictions, and you see the number of bishops that are there. You see the number that I have that are sitting out there in the Atlantic Ocean, and that is because of the concentration historically of the church has been on the East Coast in the Southeast jurisdiction, and still to this day remains that. They've often said that the Virginia Annual Conference itself is within several hundred members of the entire western jurisdiction of the United States. This is my jurisdiction. This is the Northeast jurisdiction, and you will see that the concentration of persons in that jurisdiction is actually in Pennsylvania, where the former Evangelical United Brethren and the Methodist Church were very, very strong, and given Old St. George's in Philadelphia, as well as the work in Baltimore that migrated into that area. I'm from the New England Annual Conference, and Sudha Davidar is my bishop at the very top picture in the buried there in the Atlantic Ocean. And Bishop McLee, who is in the New York area, has just been elected, and he comes from my annual conference. This is the Western jurisdiction, and we have shrunk it to fit on the slide, but it clearly is the largest landmass, but only has 5 bishops. And that has to do with the population in the annual conference. And then there is the South Central jurisdiction, which is also a very large jurisdiction, second only to the Southeast jurisdiction. You will see that there is a specific linguistic, and that's the note there on the slide, that there is a Spanish-speaking annual conference because of its proximity to Mexico and the number of Spanish-speaking immigrants that are there. And these are bishops that are in the central conferences. And there are 3 central conferences that to be paid attention to. 3, period, but we pay attention to. One of them is Europe and Eurasia, and there are 4 episcopal areas, and you see those bishops are at the top. And Rosemary Wenner, who is the third from the left there, she is the president of the Council of Bishops. Remember, the Global Council, which is an attempt, at least on the bishops' end of this, to become much more global in terms of who their administrator would be. You see on the right-hand side, there are 3 bishops there. Those are our bishops in the Philippines, and there are 3 episcopal areas. And there are 9, and you see them both to the left and at the bottom of the slide. There are 9 bishops, if I'm counting appropriately, who are in the episcopal areas in Africa. And so these are basically United Methodist bishops, and they are the fruit, I think, of the missionary attempts of the United Methodist Church, or what then was the Methodist Episcopal and Methodist Episcopal South Church during the 19th century, have come to be fully part of the global church and annual conferences in and of their own rights. The bishop is our episcopal leader and is the president, the presiding officer of the annual conference. You will see in paragraph 414 to begin to describe what the bishop is, both a spiritual and a temporal leader. The temporal leader, the administrator of the full church as well as specifically the annual conference, but is growing in that understanding of a bishop as a spiritual leader, the connectional officer and chief itinerant of the church. Fundamentally makes and fixes appointments, makes and fixes charge conference membership for all appointed clergy, which basically means that if I am an itinerant elder or deacon or a deacon in the church, and I'm serving in a local church, that's my charge conference. I am not serving in a local church as a professor here at Garrett Evangelical, but I still have to have a charge conference in my home conference, which the bishop must approve. And so my charge conference in the New England Conference is Carter Memorial United Methodist Church in Needham, Massachusetts. My bishop, Bishop Davidar, must approve on a yearly basis my appointment as an extension minister, extending the local church here at Garrett Evangelical Theological Seminary. Yearly, I ask for that appointment, and it has been given, thank God. But because I am in the Northern Illinois Conference where I work, I also relate to Bishop Sally Dick, and I must have a charge conference here in Northern Illinois, which I hold in First United Methodist Church of Evanston. All of those are under the supervision of a bishop. I'm not a free agent. In my ordination vows, I agreed to serve under the supervision and the appointment of a bishop. And the bishop takes in and of themselves the responsibility to have a cabinet, district superintendents. District superintendents are an extension of the bishop. There is no question about that. They may have a certain amount of jurisdiction in their bishops, in their districts, but they are an extension of the bishops. Their particular care is of the local ministry and oversight of it and the clergy who serve it. They are to be specifically concerned about nurturing churches in communities of witness and service to the world. Hear that. Nurturing communities of witness and service to the world. They too are spiritual and pastoral leaders. They too have personnel that are in their district offices that help them to oversee this work, as well as volunteer leaders of the various district agencies. The district superintendent is part of the pastoral team of the charges and becomes the pastor if there is a vacancy in a local situation. And I have known here in my work as a professor at the seminary that district superintendents personally have taken over as pastor for a short period of time when a vacancy has all of a sudden happened in a local church. And I have been asked on a couple of occasions to then fill in for the district superintendent until they can find a new pastor. And the district superintendent is the chief connectional officer to the charge conference, and the staff parish relations committee. And so here you have it. The conference and the bishop. These are the two foci of this particular lecture. And they grow up together. The conference, the place of connection, the place of vision and mission and the fullness of the church. The conference, the place where, if you will, clergy are made by election and ordination and then appointed to the various charges so that the administration and mission of the church in its local experience can happen. The bishop, the continuity of the apostolic ministry of the church, the president of conference, the general itinerant of the whole church, both protected, both part of our Constitution, both essential to our understanding of the United Methodist Church, the way it works and the way it dispenses its mission. Both have been criticized over the years, none more heavily than the bishops. There have been attempts to eradicate the episcopacy from the United Methodist Church. And from time to time over the years, I have questioned whether bishops should be a lifetime appointment or should be a term appointment, or whether we needed them at all. Or even whether there should be a new shift, that they again become the chief itinerants, evangelists, and missionaries of the church, and leave the appointments up to the executive session. But despite the criticism, despite the calls for reform, the bishops of the church have been responsible for our continuity, for holding together the connection, for consulting with one another about the broadness of the mission of the church in its global expression. And although we may call for reform, the Episcopal office in the United Methodist Church has stood the test of time. It may not be comfortable in a more democratic world to have one that has so much authority over so many lives. But we trust them with our lives, with our trust, with the ministry and the mission to which we have been called. They hold one another accountable and responsible. And although they are, like all of us, imperfect human beings in an imperfect church, to know them, to know their heart, to know their faith, is to understand why over time the United Methodist Church, despite all of its challenges, has maintained the Episcopal office as we know it, and the conferences as we are connected. We will look into the broader administration of the church and the General Conference in the next sessions, but just for today, the bishops, the superintendents, the jurisdictional and annual conference. These are the important connectional bodies and people to whom we belong and with whom we serve. God bless you.